Welcome everybody to the third episode of this series where I'm walking you through how to build a full stack application from the ground up using Remix, Tailwind CSS, MongoDB, and Prisma. In the last video we set up authentication for our website, which included a sign in and sign up screen. And in this video we're going to be setting up the main functionality of our website, which is giving the users the ability to send Kudos to one another and to view the Kudos in their feed with some sorting and filtering options, and then we'll also have a few other little display options that will require us to build some queries with special filters on them. So let's jump into the code and see where we left off and then get going on our task for today. So jumping into the code here, we can see we have our application where we left off last time, and we've got our components folder here where we have a form field and a layout component, which are both just reusable components that we'll be reusing throughout this application. And then we have a couple of routes. We have our login route and our index route, which is currently the home of our application. However, in this video, we're going to be changing that. We're going to be using a concept called nested routes in Remix, which requires you to work in a route other than the index route. So we're going to be setting up a separate home route. So if we want to go ahead and get started with that, let's set up a new file. And it'll be called home.tsx. And within that file, we're just going to export a basic route. So let's go ahead and export a default function, and it'll be called home. And for now, this is going to return just an H2. Oops. There we go. And we're going to say it's called homepage. For this route, we don't want a user to be able to get to this route unless they're logged in. So I'm going to paste in a little bit of code here and walk through what it does. This is just setting up a loader. If you remember from our last video, a loader is a function that gets called basically before our page is rendered, and it gets called on the server side, does some processing, and if everything passes, it'll return its data to the home page. So right here, we're using our require user ID function. If a user is not logged in, this will route you to the login screen. Otherwise, it's going to return null because it's not really returning any data. So this just ensures that no user can get to this page if they are not logged in. Along with that, we don't want a user to be able to hit this index route anymore. This will be our new, basically our index route. So let's go over to this guy. And what we're going to do is turn this into a resource route. And a resource route is basically a route in Remix that doesn't return a component, a React component. What it does is it just maybe does a loader, or it has an action in it, and it won't end up rendering anything. So this route here is going to end up doing essentially what this home route was doing, where we're requiring a user ID, and instead of returning null though, if our user is logged in, it'll just redirect them to the home page. That way, if anyone does try to hit the base route of our website, it'll just send them right over to the home page. So I'm actually going to copy over this part here from the home page, and I will paste it into this file. And then instead of returning null, it'll return redirect to home. And we can see that got imported up here automatically. And then because this doesn't return a React component, we are not rendering any JSX. Let's make this a .ts file. So now if we go ahead and run this code, npm run dev, this will start up our server, and I'll pull that over here. And I'll log in. So yeah, we're at this home page, and then if we try to hit the base route, we just get redirected right to the home page. So that's exactly what we wanted. And now that we've got that, we can start actually fleshing out our home page. By the time we've finished this video, our goal is to have created a page that looks essentially like this. On the left-hand side, we're going to have a list of users that we could scroll through, and we can sign out if we hit this button on the bottom. In the middle, we have our feed of Kudos, and on the right side, we've got this list of the most recent 3 Kudos that have been sent through our website. And the first part that we're going to tackle is this side over here, and then we're going to essentially go left to right. So we're going to get the user list going. And to do so, the very first thing we'll do is go into our code and create a new component file called user_panel.tsx. This file for now will just export a basic component, and I'm going to go ahead and paste some code in here. And what this does is it exports our user panel component. It has just a couple of styles and a little bit of structure to the page here. And so that's going to be the starting point that we're going to work with. First thing we're going to want to do is import this into our home page. Import user panel, and that'll automatically import there. And then we're going to want to set up a little bit of structuring on our home page. And to do that, the very first thing we're going to do is import our layout component, because we want every page we have to be wrapped in this. And we'll go ahead and render one of those here. And within that, we'll give it a div and some class names on this. We're going to make sure this is the full height of the screen, and we'll be using flex inside of this, so we'll go ahead and give it that class now. And then finally, we'll render out our user panel. And if we head back over to the browser, we should see our nice blue styles here. That's from our layout component, and then our component on the left side. Currently, it does not have users, but we'll get going on that right now. To show users in our user panel, we're going to need to query for all of the users. So let's go to utils, and we have this users.server file over here. And we're going to add a new function. And this function will be called getOtherUsers. And I'm calling it that because we want to find every user who is not the logged in user, because you won't need to see yourself in that list because you don't want to send yourself kudos. So I will add export const getOtherUsers equals, and this will be an async function. And it'll take in a user ID that we're going to use to filter out our currently logged in user. And then what this is going to do is a Prisma query. So we'll await prisma.user.findMany. And we want to find any user where the ID is not equal to the ID that we passed the function. So we'll say not and user ID. And then after that, we're going to go ahead and order our results so that it's not just a random list. We want to order by the user's first name. So we can do that by doing order by. And then we have our profile embedded document, so we can reach into that and order by the first name key. And we're going to do ascending. So as you can see here, it's pretty easy to reach into an embedded document and do processing based on fields within those. So what this function is going to do for us is get any user except for the user with this ID and return those. So if we go back over to our home.tsx, now we can use that over here in our loader, and then we can pass the users we get from that to the user panel. So what I'm going to do is do const user ID equals this, because if you remember, this function actually returns the user ID if it finds one. And then we can do const users equals await get other users, import that, and we'll pass it our user ID. Finally, over here, we will change this to return JSON, and we'll give it our users. And then, now that we have those, we can import another utility from Remix, and it's going to be called useLoaderData. So we'll do import useLoaderData. And that gives us access to the data returned from our loader. So we can use that here, const data equals useLoaderData. And I'll actually destructure this data and just pull out the users. And with that, we can pass it to our user panel. But our user panel does not currently take in a prop for these users, so we're going to need to add one. If we go back to our user panel file, up at the very top, we can add a new prop, and we're going to describe that prop with an interface. So let's do interface props, and this is going to take in some users, and we want to give this a type of users, and Prisma actually generates one of those for us, so we can import user from Prisma client. And that's the type that Prisma gives us when it generates Prisma client. And so here now we can use that. We're going to get an array of users. And now we can say this is going to take in a users property, and that object will be of the type props. Now that we have that in here, we can actually render out our users. But rather than writing some JSX here, we're going to actually create a new component and we'll render that for each user. So create a new component and we're going to call it user circle.tsx. And we're calling it that because if you remember from the picture I showed you, the users will be displayed in a circle with a couple of characters of their names in it. So I'm going to paste the component here, and we can see we're importing another type from Prisma client, and that's called profile. And that'll match up with the profile embedded document that we set up. Prisma client generates a type for each of those embedded documents. And we're giving this a couple of props. We're giving it a profile prop, which will be the profile of the user that we're passing in. Class names, which we'll be using here to add additional class names to the wrapping div. That way, if we want to give it some custom styles and not have it look exactly the same everywhere, we can configure that with class names. And then finally, an on-click handler. At some point in this video, we are going to be triggering actions when user circles are clicked. So this will allow us to pass it a function to actually call when the circle is clicked. And for now, we are rendering the first character of the first name and the first character of the last name in our user circle. Later on in another video, we're going to be adding a user profile picture component. But for now, this is what we'll be displaying. So that's our user circle component. We can go back over to our user panel now and import that. And then we can do here, users.map. And this will return a user circle. And for this user circle, we'll pass the profile, and that will be user.profile. And you can see we get this nice auto completion because we are using this user type from Prisma client. This just shows how easily we can reach end-to-end type safety using Prisma with Remix. Because it is a full stack framework, we can easily get access to these types on our front end and our back end, and even our database with the Prisma scheme over here. So that's really nice to make things nice and easy. But yeah, let's go ahead and use profile, and we'll give this a key because every map to React component needs a key to identify it. So we'll do user.id as the key. And then we're going to give this a couple of class names, and I'll paste those class names here. And what that's going to do is make sure that the height and width are 24. That's if we hover here, we can see that's 6 rem. We are giving it a margin of auto on the X side and then a flex shrink of 0 so that none of these elements will shrink when the browser size changes. So let's see what that looks like in the browser now. We can see this user here, and it just has SA. We get our pointer when we hover over it, so that's good. We're showing users now. At this point, now what we need to do is add the ability to log out, and then that should wrap up this side panel for us for now. In order to get the logout functional, we're going to create another route to handle our logout, and this route can be another resource route because it's never going to render any JSX. All it'll do is get hit by some form, it will perform the logout action, and then it'll redirect you to the login page. So if we go into our routes folder, create a new file, and it's going to be called logout.ts. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to set up a loader function, which will just redirect you to the home page because this should never handle a GET request. So that'll just prevent an error from happening if a GET request ever does occur to this route. And the main important piece that we're going to add is an action function that actually performs the logout when it receives a post request. So let's export const action, and this will be an action function. And it'll be an async function with a request being pulled out of it. And this is going to perform a logout, and we're passing it the request. And this logout function is actually a function that was written in the last video of this series where we did authentication. So I'll go ahead and import that up here. And with that, now if a post request is performed to the logout route of this website, it will log you out. And this function, actually, if we click on it here, it does log you out, and then it redirects you to the login screen. So that does all we need it to there. Now let's handle the GET request scenario. So if we export a const, and this is loader, and then this will be a loader function, and another async. However, we don't need any of the parameters because all we're going to do is redirect to the base route. And we're not redirecting to the home route here because we actually want to redirect to index.ts, where it will verify if a user even exists that's logged in or not. And if not, it'll return you to the login screen. That way we get that extra authentication there. And the last little piece we're going to need here is the redirect function. So now that we have that in place, that's our fully functional route. And we can go ahead and go back to the user panel. And around this button, let's give it a form. That's going to be submitted. So we'll do form. And the method is going to be post. And the action is going to be logout. And I'll take this piece here and throw it down at the bottom. Say that should format. And there we go. So now if we click that button, it should post to the logout and it should perform this action for us. So let's go ahead and try that out. If we hit this now, there we go. We get sent back to our login screen, which means we must have been logged out. So that's looking good. And that wraps up this side panel for now. Let's go ahead and move on to the next piece, which will be allowing a user to send Kudos to another user. In order to build that piece out though, we will need to add a few components and make a few changes in our code to get this started. The very first thing that we're going to need to change is we're going to need to update our Prisma schema to account for some of the new data we'll be saving. So go ahead and pop your code open and go over to your schema.prisma file, and we're going to make some changes here. The very first change that we're going to make is we're going to add a couple of enums, and I'll paste those right here. We have this emoji enum, which defines a couple of possible values for an emoji, and a departments enum, which will be a couple of different values that a user can be related to, and it will determine which department that they're in. And then finally, we have a color enum, and this will just be a couple of color options. And what these are going to be used for is on the form that's actually used to build a Kudos and send it to somebody, we'll be able to select an emoji to send along with it, and a color to send along with it. And on that form, we're going to show which department the user is in that you are sending a Kudos to give you a little more context into who you're messaging. So those will be stored there. And the next piece that we're going to do is the actual Kudos model. So let's do that. Model Kudo. And this is going to have a very similar ID to this user model. And we're also going to want a field to show when this was created at. And then we're going to need a style key. And what this is going to hold is the different style options the user could set up for their Kudos. And we're going to store that as an embedded document. So let's create a new one of those. We'll do type Kudos style. And this will have a couple of pieces of data in there. The very first one is going to be background color. And that will be of the type color as defined by our enum. And we'll default that to yellow. And then very similar to this, we're going to have a text color. And this will default to white. And finally, we'll have the emoji option. And this will be of the emoji type. And we'll default that to the thumbs up emoji. Now, obviously, these aren't going to show actual colors and emojis when we render these into our application. These are just going to be used to key off of to know what to render in our code. So we'll give this now the Kudos style type, and that'll be optional. And that is good there. So the next thing we need to do is define a couple of relations to be able to determine a user's Kudos that they've sent and Kudos they've received. So let's add a couple of relations there for that. I'm going to paste in both of those here. So we can see here I've pasted in authored Kudos, and I've given a relation name to that called authored Kudos. That way it's a little clearer what we're working with there. And then Kudos. This will be any Kudos that your user has received. And the type for those is going to be a Kudo, and it'll be an array of those because a user can have authored many Kudos and they can have received many Kudos as well. In order for this to work, we're going to need to define the opposite relation. So the piece on the Kudos side that links them together. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll have an author here, and that'll be a user. And to relate them, we'll add a relation, and it'll reference the ID column on the user model. And for the field on the actual Kudo model, We'll do fields here, and we'll create a field called author ID in just a second. And then this is going to be defining the authored Kudos relation. That'll match up with what we added up here. And let's go ahead and add that author ID column. So we'll do author ID string, and more specifically, this is a db.object ID. And so you can see this stopped complaining. Our relation is complete there. And we're going to need something very similar to relate the next piece, the recipient. So let's copy that down. We'll call this recipient. And this will be recipient ID. And then right here, this will be recipient ID, and this will be called received Kudos. So that looks good. Our relations are defined, and we now have a way to set up users Kudos and users authored Kudos. So let's go ahead and run npx Prisma DB push. That way we can push up these changes. We did add a new collection to the database, so we need to do a push instead of just a generate there. And now that we have the data model updated, we can start building out some of the components that will allow us to set up our form. Now our form will be loaded into a modal, so let's create a couple of components to allow us to do that. And the first one will be called portal.tsx. So in your components folder, create a file called portal.tsx. And the reason we've named it portal is because we're going to be using React's create portal function, and that'll allow us to render our modal as a direct child of the body tag. That way it's not affected by any styles that are applied from parent elements. It'll be right up at the very top. So I'm actually going to paste in this function. What it's going to do is it's going to take in some children and a wrapper ID. And the children are going to be any JSX elements that this portal component wraps around when you render it onto a page. And the wrapper ID is going to be the ID of a target element somewhere on the page. So when this thing first gets rendered, it's going to look for an element in your browser with this wrapper ID as its ID. If it doesn't find one, it's going to go ahead and create one. And then it's going to create a portal to that element. So instead of rendering your modal wherever you render it in the page, so say I was in the user panel, if I rendered it in this form, rather than actually rendering it into the browser as a child of this form, it'll render it as a child of the body tag. And that's nice because it allows us to set up an absolute position or a fixed position element without it being affected by any parent styles. So we're going to be using that in another component called modal.tsx. And this will be where we actually build out our modal. And this one is another one that's a pretty generic function that I have used across multiple projects. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it here. And what this has is a modal component that uses our portal. So it's going to look for an element with a modal ID. And if it doesn't find one, it'll create it. And then it's going to render these children inside of it. And within that portal, it's going to render out these elements here. And this top one is an overlay, so this will be like the gray transparent background that shows behind a modal. And if you click on that gray background, it's going to navigate you to the home page. And I'm going to explain why that happens in just a second, but essentially, in a nutshell, it'll close our modal when we click on that. The actual modal itself is going to be a fixed element on the screen with a couple of different styles to make it look nice. We're going to be able to apply more styles to it to give it a more custom feel if we want to. And then it renders the children inside of it. And now that we have our modal component available to use, let's go ahead and put it to use. And to do so, we're going to set up a subroute of our home route. And within that subroute, we'll render our modal. So anytime we go to that subroute, our modal will render above our home page. And here's how we'll do that. If you go into the routes folder, create a new directory in there called home. And this name is important because we do have a file called home.tsx. If we name a folder the exact same name, any file within that folder is going to be recognized as a child route. So we'll create a new file in there called kudo.$user-ID. And the $sign emphasizes that that piece of the URL is going to be basically a variable you can pass through the URL. And with that there, we have a subroute, and to actually render that out, we're going to use the outlet component that Remix gives us. and we will render it right here. So we'll do outlet. And just to show what this is actually going to do, I'll export a default function here called Kudos modal. And I will return a modal component. And I'll actually import that component. And this modal does require a couple options. I think there's one required, is open, and we will just make that always true because anytime we're at this subroute, we want this modal to be open. And within there, I'll do h2. This is a modal. And so now what this is going to do is if we're at /home, it's going to show our home page. But then if we go to /home/kudos/some value, it's going to render our home page. And right here, it's going to render our modal, which will be rendered above all of this because it's a fixed position element. And let's actually see this in use. And then I'll go over here and give this a refresh. And so we see at our home, it looks exactly the same. But if we go to Kudos, some value, we're going to see this is a modal. And so this modal here is where we're going to render our form. And we're going to use this value up here that we can pass as our user ID so that we can render some details about the user that we're sending a Kudos to. So let's go ahead and get that built. The first piece of that we're going to build is the actual query to get a user's details. So if we go into users.server.ts, let's export a new function here, export const, and we'll call it get user by ID. And this will be an async function, and it's going to take in a user ID. That's a string. And this is just going to return the results of a query. So we'll do return await prisma.user.findUnique. And within that, we're going to provide a filter here. And so we'll say where the user's ID matches whichever user ID that we pass to this function. And that's all this function really needs to do. We'll just get all the fields in the document returned back from this function. And with that, we can go on to the next piece, which is actually having a way to open our modal with a valid user ID. Currently, we would have to manually input an ID into the URL, and that won't really work for a user. They won't have access to those IDs. So we need to have a way to be able to click on a user and do that. So if we go to our user panel over here, what we're going to do is use the onClick attribute of our user circle to cause a navigation. So to do that, we can use Remix's useNavigate function, and that's from the Remix run React. And then that is a hook, so in here we'll hook into that. We'll call it navigate. And now we have this navigate function that triggers a navigation for us, and we'll use that in here. So we'll do onClick. So when a user clicks on this, they will get the navigate function, and it's going to navigate them to /home/kudos, and then we'll do the user ID. And so with that, we'll actually go over to the browser to see what that does. If we click on a user here, it'll pop this open with a valid user ID. And all that we need to do next is actually use the user ID that we're getting passed here. And we can do that by setting up a loader. And this will be an asynchronous function. And we're going to pull out a params key from it. And this will have any URL parameters, which we have defined as $user ID. So we can do const user ID here, and that'll equal params. And so that'll give us a user ID, but this user ID is potentially undefined because it is a URL value. So we're going to just say if the type of our user ID does not equal a string, so if we're not given a valid string here, then just close the modal by navigating home. So we'll do return redirect home. However, if we do get a valid user, we want to grab that user using the new function that we just wrote and then return it from our loader in a JSON object. So we'll do const user equals await get user by ID, and I'll import that here. And we'll say user ID. So now we've got our user, and we will return it in a JSON response from our loader. And then with that, we can actually hook into that in our modal down here by doing const, and we'll say user equals use loader data, and I'll import that. And then finally, let's go ahead and just render out some of the user's details here to make sure we've got the right one. So we'll do user.profile.firstname, and I'll fix this guy. And now let's go ahead and, oh, we got to export this. Cool. Now that that's done, we can go to the browser and see this in action. So I'll click this here, and we should see the name Sabin pop up. And we do. This is a modal Sabin. So we've got our user details and we have our modal. Let's actually build out some of the form so that we can send Kudos to that user. So I'm going to pull over this image. And this here is going to be what the form's going to look like once it's finished. So we're going to have a couple of columns here, and this first column is going to have some details on the user that's actually being sent to Kudos, and then this side will be the actual details of the Kudos that you can fill out. And then we'll have a second row in this form where we have a preview and a send button. And so this we're going to set up by just using a bunch of different flex classes to position all of the elements. And what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to paste in the form's sort of structure, the JSX of it, and I'll walk through a little bit of what some of it's doing. So if we go over to this modal, the very first thing I'm going to do is actually rename this variable to recipient, because this will hold the recipient of our data. So recipient, and recipient. There we go. And then I'll get rid of this stuff. And I'm going to change this modal so that it has a width of 2/3. So that's going to take up 2/3 of the screen. And we'll give it a padding of 10 so that it has a good amount of padding in there. The next thing I'm going to do here is actually paste in our form. So if I paste this guy, and this is where I'll just sort of walk through what this is doing. So this is just rendering out our form, and it's going to post because we will be setting up an action function on this route. And then it's got a hidden value, and this is going to hold the recipient's ID. And then we're setting up some of those rows and columns. And I am going to scroll through this. Feel free to pause the video if you're copying this down, and then just copy some of these classes. We're using Flex to set up different columns. And then if we're on different size screens, we're switching it to rows. That way everything aligns properly. So I'll just scroll through a little bit of this. And we can see we are using the user circle component here. So I'll import that by Control Space, and then I'll hit Enter there. And right here we have this form data, and we don't actually have a form data variable yet. So let's create that. Const form data set form data equals use state, and we'll have a message key that's going to default to a blank string, and I'll import that use state function. And then we also have this handle change function, and so what that is just a function that's going to be called whenever our text area's value is changed, and it'll update the state with that new current value. So let's go ahead and build that piece. What that's going to look like is it'll be a const called handle change, and that's going to be a function that takes in an event, and that'll be a React change event, and this will be for an HTML input element or for a HTML text area element. There we go. And then field will be a string because we are going to pass it which field we're trying to update. And what this will do is it'll call our set form data function. It'll take the form as it is right now. It'll spread that out into a new object, and it'll update just the field that we're targeting with the target's value, e.target.value. So now as our form values change in the text area, it'll actually update the form variable over here. And right now we have a couple of placeholders here. We have a section where some select boxes are going to go and where a preview of the Kudos is going to go. But before we build those, let's look at what it looks like so far. So we've got our user's details sitting right here and our text box where we can type in, and that's all looking good. So the next piece is actually adding the select boxes down here where you can select a couple of options like the background color and the text color and the emoji to display with this Kudo. So let's add that, and we're actually going to create a new component for this called select box because we don't want to have to rewrite this a bunch of times. So I'll create that new component there in selectbox.tsx, and we'll go ahead and get going on this component. So I'm going to paste in the code for that. And what we get here is a select box component. This component is going to allow us to pass in the options, which we'll map through down here and render out. And then we can pass it a couple of other things like a class name, a container class name, which will be the div that wraps around the select box itself, and a name, ID, value, and label. And these are all just going to be to fill out the attributes right here that we would use if we were setting it up within the form directly. So now that we have this controlled component that allows us to render a select box with a label, let's use it in our modal. So I'll import it up here, import select box from components select box. These components are going to allow you to select a couple of options for the background colors, the text colors, and the emojis. And those are going to be based off of our schema.prisma. We have our enum set up here with possible values. But we can't actually do anything with these values because they won't map to any actual colors or emojis. So we need to build up a little map of that on our own. So let's create a new file in our utils folder called constants.ts. And this is going to hold just constant values that we use throughout our application. We will be reusing some of these values a couple of different places, so it's nice to have them in a little shared location. And what this is going to do is just set up sort of mapping. So we have all of our values from our enum here, and we are letting the application know what to map those values to as far as Tailwind CSS classes go. So for example, if yellow is picked for the text color, it would map to the yellow 300 color in Tailwind. So since we have those, we can actually use them in our modal now. But this format isn't going to help us very much with the select box options because this is just a key value where we need something more like value would be the Tailwind CSS class name and the name would be like red. We need it in that format. So let's create a function in our modal that actually does that for us. So let's do const get options equals, and this will just take in a couple of options. So we'll give it data, and this will be pretty much any kind of data. And we'll just get all of the keys. And we'll pass that through a reduce function, and that'll be building up an array, and we'll give it the current value. And what this is going to start with is an array. So what's going to happen in this is we're getting all of the keys, and then we're going to map through those keys basically and pass it through our reduce function. And what this function is going to do is it's going to push a new value to our accumulated value. And that value is going to be a name, and that will just be the key. And what I did here with that key name, which we've called current here, is I've taken it and I've capitalized the first letter and lowercase the other letters. That way it's a little bit more readable in our form. And then the value will be just the unformatted value there. And then finally, we need to return our accumulated value so that our array keeps accumulating the different options. So this is taking our key value pair and turning it into an array of name and value objects. So since we have that, we can now use that function. So let's get our color map first. So that'll be get options. And then we'll have to pass it in our color data. So let's import that in the top. So we'll be importing from utils, constants, and we're just going to go ahead and get everything here because we'll end up needing it all. Color map and emoji map. Cool. Now if we go down here, we'll do colors equals get options, and we'll pass it our color map. And then we'll do another one for our emojis, get options, and this will be emoji map. And now that we have those colors and emojis, let's add our select boxes. So I'm going to go down to the comment we have with the placeholder value, and I'll render a select box. And I'll give this some space because we're going to add some attributes to it. And we can give it the options of colors, because this is going to be for our background color. So we'll also give this a name of background color and a value of formData.style.background color. And that actually doesn't exist yet. So let's go up here and we'll create that. This is going to take in a style key, which will essentially map to our Kudos style embedded document. So I'll go ahead and actually type this as a Kudos style from our Prisma client. And this will have a background color, and the default for this is just going to be red. And I'll also give it text color because we'll be adding that in a second, and that'll default to white. And then our emoji will be thumbs up. So we have our form data set up. Now we can keep going on this guy down here. The next piece we're going to add is a label, and this will just say background color and a container class name. We're going to make the container of our select box a little bit wider than it was. And then we'll style the actual select box itself. So we'll say that it should take up the full width of its parent container, and it should be rounded and have a couple of padding options. So I'll do padding x3 and padding y of 2. And the text is going to be gray 400. And then the last piece we need is a function to actually handle our state when the select box's value changes. So we'll do on change, and this will be passed an event. And we're going to need to write a new function to handle this. And our new function is going to be really similar to our handle chains function. So I'll just copy this down actually, except this will be called handle style change. And the reason we're going to do a different function here for this is because the key we're updating is not directly in our form data object. It's actually in the nested object style. And so we'll do this here, so that now when we run our update, we'll get our entire form, except we're going to update one key in our style object. So with that, we can add that in down here with our select box, and we'll pass it our event and the key name that we're going to be updating, and that's background color. And the rest of the boxes are going to be really similar to this one, so I will copy and paste them down. The only difference here is going to be that this one will be text color, and I'll change this as well. And then this one will be emojis. So I will update these. And with those in place, we should be rendering our select boxes properly onto the page. Although I did notice one little issue we have right here. We don't need to be pushing an array, we're just pushing a single object into an array. So now we should be properly adding our options. So let's pop open the browser and see what that looks like. I go to the form. We should now see these drop-down options, and selecting those options will be updating our form data. So that's working great. The next piece that we have on this is to build the preview component, which is going to display a Kudo right here in the bottom corner, and it's going to be the actual same component that we use on the Kudo feed eventually, so we'll be able to reuse that guy. Head on over to your components folder and add a new component file there called kudo.tsx. And in this component, we're going to be importing a couple of different other components that we have. So I'll be importing user circle, because we are going to display user circle on the Kudos. It's going to show the sender. And then we're going to import the different color and emoji options also, because this is where we'll actually put those key value pairs to use to display the proper colors. So I'll import color map and background color map and the emoji map. And then from this file, we can export a function called Kudo. And for now, let's make an interface for our props. Interface props. And we're going to be passing this component a profile because we need to be able to display the sender's profile. So this will be the profile type. And that's provided by Prisma client that was generated off of our schema. And then we're also going to send in a Kudo. But we're not sending the entire Kudo object, so we're actually going to specify that this is a partial Kudo. And one thing where this gets tricky is that we have a component name with the same name as our type we're passing in. So I'm actually going to prefix this with I. And when I import it here, I'm going to do Kudo as I Kudo. That way we know that's just the interface for our Kudo. So let's go ahead and pull those out of our parameters, profile and Kudo, and this will be of the props type. And we'll return some JSX. So we're going to wrap all of our component in a div, and this div will have a couple of different class names. And for those class names, we're going to use a template string because we're going to optionally add in classes based on the color options chosen by the user. But first and foremost, this is going to be a flex div. We're going to use flex styles in it. And then this second one here, this is where we're going to use the template variables. We will add background color map. And then whatever the kudos.style.background color is, we want to use that background color. And if there was no background color because it is optional, then we will make it red. Next, we are going to add a couple more styles to just make this a little bit prettier. We'll give the div some padding. We'll make it rounded as we've made a lot of other elements rounded. We'll give it the full width of whatever space it's given. And gap x 2, just to space things out a little. And then it'll be a relative position in there. Inside of this, we're going to have another div, and this will have the user circle, and we'll pass it a profile. So this will be the profile from our parameters. And we'll give it an extra class name to make sure it has a width and height of 16. After that, we've got another div, and this will have a couple classes as well. This will have a flex, so it'll be a flex box, and it will be showing its items in a column layout. And this is where we're going to display the actual text from the Kudos and the user's name. So let's do P, and in here we will give this some class names. And this is also going to use template variables because we are going to change the text color based on the user's options. So we'll do sort of a similar thing we did before. We'll do kudo.style, and this time we'll do text color. And if none was provided, we'll default it to white. After that, we'll give it a bold font, and we'll make the text large for this one, because this is where we're actually going to display the sender's first and last name. So we'll do profile.first name in here and profile.last name. And to finish off the styles of this, we're just gonna add some font styles that make it a little bit prettier to look at. We'll do white space pre, and I think I want wrap, white space pre wrap, and then break all. And that'll just make sure that if for some reason the name has to wrap to the next line, it will still look nice. And I'm going to copy this guy over because we're going to use the same formatting. The only difference is that instead of rendering a first and last name, this is where we'll render the actual Kudo message. And it looks like we're getting an error here. And if we look at that, the message does not exist on our Kudo type. So if we pop open our schema, it looks like we haven't added a message key yet, which will be an important one. So let's go ahead and add that now. We'll do message, we'll say that's a string, and then we will regenerate our Prisma client. So npx Prisma generate. Once that finishes, this should stop complaining at us, and we can move on to the last piece, which is to display the emoji that the user selected. And for this, we'll again render a div. And inside of that, we're just going to render emoji map, and it'll be the kudo.style.emoji key. And if that doesn't exist, we'll do thumbs up. And this should be an optional key because it might be null. And then we're going to have a couple of styles on this, and I'm going to paste these ones in here. What we're doing is we're giving this an absolute position, and it's going to be at the very bottom right of the Kudo. And it's just going to have a rounded look. It's going to be a full circle, and it will be centered within this div. That's all we needed for that component. So let's go back to our Kudo modal and import it. We'll do import Kudo from components. And then way down here at the bottom where our preview is said to go, we're going to go ahead and render it. So if we replace this with Kudo, and we'll give it a profile, and this will be user.profile. And actually our user doesn't exist yet. This is going to be the currently logged in user, so we actually need to get that data from up here in our loader. So if you go back into your loader, do const user equals await get user, and this is a function from our auth function, and we're going to pass the request object into this. That comes from the parameters up here, and then we can return it from our loader. After that, we'll need to make sure to add that to the use loader data. So we'll do user, and now the currently logged in user's data will be passed to our Kudo. After that, we need the actual Kudo itself, and this will just be the form data because that's going to hold our entire configuration for the Kudo. So I've hit save on that, and let's see what it looks like in the browser. There we go. So we've got our preview showing up here. Currently there's no text because I haven't typed anything in, but as I do, it should be automatically updated. And one problem I notice is that the text of the message is actually just as bold as the name, and I don't really like that very much. So let's go into our Kudo component, and in here we'll get rid of the font bold, and we'll also get rid of the text large and see what that looks like. So if we go back to the browser, now we should see when we type in, we get a little bit smaller text, and now it's easier to differentiate between the user's name and the message they're sending. So at this point, the Kudo component is good and our form's done, and we're ready to actually handle it. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to set up an action function. So over here in our Kudo modal, I'll do export const action, and this will be an action function type. And we'll have an async function here that has a request object being pulled out of the parameters. And we're going to grab the form data from that request object. So I'll do const form equals request.form data. And that actually returns a promise, so I'll await that. And we're also going to need the currently logged in user's ID. And we need that because we're going to use it to connect this Kudo to a user as its author. So we'll get that from our user ID method, which is require user ID. and that takes in the request. And after that, let's pull out the individual pieces of data that we want from our form object. I'll paste those here. I'm using form.get to pull out the message, background color, text color, emoji, and the recipient ID. And finally, before we actually create a Kudo, let's validate that all of that data is correct. I'm just going to do here what we've done in previous forms, where I'm making sure every bit of data that we've received is a string. And if we aren't provided a message or a recipient ID, there should be an error returned because there would be no reason to send a Kudo at that point. And then right here is where we would create our user and redirect. But we'll get back to that in a second. Beforehand, let's actually handle these errors that we're returning back to the form. And to do so, we'll go into the default function that's being exported, and we'll say const action data equals use action data. That's keying into the action data returned from our action function. And then we can set up a piece of state to hold our errors if there is one. So we'll do const form error equals use state action. If I can type that here. And it'll be action data dot error. And it has the potential to be null, so let's also give it a default of empty string. So now we have our error messages. The last piece we're going to need to do is display one if it's provided. So right here under our modal tag, right above the form, we'll just add a little div with some styling here to make the text red and give it some font styles, and we'll render out our message. So that should handle any form errors for us. And if we wanted to, we could actually test that out by adding a form error there by default. And we can see we have this form error. So that'll work once we do receive errors. The last piece that we need is to actually create our Kudos. And to do that, we're going to actually create a new file in our utils folder called kudo.server.ts. And this will hold any functions related to Kudos. The one that we're going to be writing right now is going to be a function called create Kudo. So we'll do export const create Kudo, and that'll be an async function with a couple of parameters. Most of them will be strings. So we'll do a message, that's a string. We'll do a user ID, and that's a string, and a recipient ID, it's a string. And then this last one won't be a string. This will be the style object, which will follow the Kudos style type that we defined in our schema. And this function will just do a Prisma query, so we're going to import that as well. We'll import our instance of Prisma from the prisma.server file. And we can run that now. So we'll do await prisma.kudo.create, and we'll pass this some data. The very first piece of data that we're going to give it is message, and then we will add the author as well, and we are passing in an ID to link this Kudo to an author. So we'll use the connect here, and we'll say we're going to connect it by ID. So now whichever user ID we passed in will end up being the author that's connected to this Kudo. The next one's going to be similar, except it will be the recipient. So we're going to connect a recipient to this Kudo based off of the recipient ID we pass in. And the last piece of data that we're going to give it is the style embedded document. And with that, we've got a function to create the Kudo, so we can go ahead and use that over here. We will await create Kudo, and we'll import that function, and we'll give it our message. We'll give it our user ID. We'll give it the recipient ID and the style, which will be an object here with the background color, text color, and emoji. And this is going to complain because it just sees a normal object. It's expecting a Kudo style object, so we have to add as Kudo style at the end. Cool. So once that runs, we want to close the modal because they'll be done there. So let's redirect them, return, redirect to the home page, and that'll just close the modal for us. And so when we submit this form now, it's going to actually create that Kudo. It's going to link it to the author and the recipient correctly, and it'll redirect you home, but we won't be able to actually see that it's done anything yet. So let's build our feed before we go test this out. Head over to your home.tsx, and we'll be rendering our feed right under where our user panel is in the code here. But we are also going to eventually be rendering a search bar at the top of the feed and the recent Kudos section to the side of the feed. So there are going to be some crafty flex boxes that we're going to have to set up. And so I'll just build those slowly here. We've got our first div is going to be a flex with flex column. That way we can have the search bar appear above our feed, and our search bar is going to end up being here. And then under that, we'll have our actual feed div. So this will be having a class name with flex1, and it's going to be a flex box. That way it takes up the full size of the parent div. And then within this div, we're going to have yet another div. And this will be the one that we render the Kudos items actually into. So we'll give this one a padding of 10. This will be flex, and it'll be flex column so that the Kudos are one on top of the other. And then we'll give it a gap Y of 4 to space the Kudos out a little bit. And within this is where we're going to actually map through all of our Kudos and render a Kudos component for each one. And under this will be where the recent Kudos end up going. But for this piece, to render those out, we're going to need to actually get our list of Kudos. And to do that, we'll need to create a new function to grab those. So head back to your kudo.server.ts file, and we're going to export a new const called getFilteredKudos, and that'll be an async function. And the reason we're calling it getFilteredKudos is because we're going to actually be able to pass in sorting options and where filter options to this to tweak the results we get from our query. But the first parameter is going to be a user ID, which will be the ID of the person whose Kudos these belong to, and then a sort filter, and that'll come from the Prisma namespace imported from the Prisma client, and it'll be an object in there called Kudo order by with relation input. There we go. And that'll just be the basically the order by object that you could pass into your query. This is the type that defines that. And then finally in here, we'll have a where filter, and that'll also come from the Prisma namespace, and it'll be Kudo where input. Now this function needs to return a query, so we'll do return await prisma.kudo.find many. And we're going to find many Kudos where the ID matches the ID that we passed in. So we'll do where the recipient ID matches our user ID. And then we're also going to spread the where filter into here so that we can add on our specific options. And after this, we'll have our order by, and we'll just pass that in. We'll pass the sort filter into there that we built up. And then we can select out the individual pieces of data that we want. And what these are going to be is the Kudos ID, oops, and the style options, and the message. And then we'll want some details about the author. So we'll get into the author, and we will select out the profile data. And there we go. If that all looks good, then we should be wrapped up with this function. We can actually use that now to get our list of Kudos in the home page's loader. So we'll go into the loader, add a new const called Kudos, and that'll be get filtered Kudos. And we're going to pass this the user ID, we're going to pass it 2 empty objects for now because we're not going to actually submit any filters until we have our search bar. But we can now give that to the response from the loader, pull it out here, and we can use that to render our list of kudos. In here we'll do kudos.map, and for each kudo we're going to render a kudo component, so I'll import that guy. And because we are mapping over this, we're going to give this a key with kudo.id, and we'll give it the actual kudo object, so this will be kudo. And we'll give it the profile details of the author. So we'll do kudo.author.profile. And then we'll see that this is complaining because it implicitly has an any type. The way we need to actually type this is as a kudo with additional information on it. It's going to have the author and the profile details. So we're going to have to build up sort of our own type. And to do that, let's go ahead and create an interface here. And we're going to call it kudo with author, and this will just extend the kudo model, and I'll call it iKudo because we already have a kudo component. And if we go up here, I don't think I'm importing anything from Prisma yet, so I'll import kudo as iKudo from Prisma client. And within this, we're going to have our author key and a profile key in there, and it will have the profile type from Prisma. And I'll have to import that up here at the top. So the result of this is we're going to define an object that is basically shaped like a kudo, except it also has an author key with profile data in it. And if we open this up, we'll give this parameter that type. So we'll do kudo with author, and that should stop complaining at us. With this in place, we should have our feed being rendered, and let's go ahead and look at it in the browser. So I'll open up my browser, give this a refresh, and we can see that I now get this nice little feed of kudos. And this gets us pretty close to where we want to be. The last pieces that we need, though, are our search component up here and our recent kudos panel on the side. So let's actually do the recent kudos panel first. I'm going to create a new component in here called recent bar.tsx. And this is just going to essentially loop over the top 3 most recent kudos and render them out. And I'm just going to paste in this component and walk through what it does. We're doing the same kind of trick here where we're getting the kudo type, and we're saying that we also want to add a recipient key to it. And then we actually have our component. So this is going to take in the top 3 kudos, and they will be of that type that we just created. And we're going to render them in a div that's going to be a panel on the right side of the screen. And it's going to have a nice header here with the recent kudos, and we'll loop through our options. To render out our list, though, we're also going to need a function to grab the top 3 most recent kudos. So let's go back to our kudos.server.ts file, and we'll export another function. That'll be export const, and we're going to call this function get recent kudos. And this will be an async function. And we don't need to pass any parameters into this because it's just going to grab all of the top 3 most recent kudos. And this will return a query. So we're going to return await prisma.kudo.findMany. And we're going to take only the top 3 records that we find. And we're going to order by the created at key. And this will be descending. And then finally, we're going to select out the data that we care about in this. So we will select, we're going to select something from the style. So from within the style embedded document, we're going to select the emoji. And just for some more context into what we're going to show is the user circle with just the emoji rendered over on top of it. So we need some of the recipient's details along with the emoji. So next after this, we'll get recipient And we'll select out some data from that. We'll grab the ID and the profile details. And that wraps up our get recent kudos function. So we can go back to home and we can use that over here. We'll do const recent kudos equals await get recent kudos, and that should do it there. And we just have to return this. So we'll do recent kudos here, and we'll pull it out of our use loader data hook down here. And now we have access to those. So we can replace this with our new recent bar component. And for kudos, we will pass in the recent kudos object. Awesome, so that should render out our kudos for us. Let's go and take a look. And it does. So we see right up here, we've got our header that we had defined and our list. And this is just showing the top three. It's rendering a user circle and it's rendering the emoji over it. So that looks nice, and the very last piece that we're going to need to build is our search bar up here at the top. There's going to be two pieces to this search bar. The very first piece is the actual component that we'll render that holds our search form, and the next piece is a action function on our home route that'll handle the submitted form and refresh the data. So let's start off by building the actual search bar component. And I'll go into components and I'll create a new file called searchbar.tsx. And within that file, we'll just export a component. So we'll export function search bar. And right now I will say search bar. Now let's go ahead and render this into our home component just to get it started. So we'll import it up here at the top. And we'll replace this comment down here with the search bar component. That should render our component on the page, so let's take a look. And I'll refresh this. And we do see we have our search bar component. So that's looking good. Now we just need to flesh it out. So pop that file back open again, and let's start building it. Let's modify what this returns first. This will return a form. And this will have a couple of class names that I'll just paste in. Essentially what this is going to do is give it a full width and just a couple of extra styles on top of it. So it's got some padding, it'll be a flex item, and just a gap between all the elements inside of it, along with a big border of blue on the bottom. And within this, we're going to render out another div that's going to have our input field. So this will have an input field and an SVG component over on the top of it that will give the search icon, and I'll show what that looks like here. We get this search icon right here. And so feel free to copy some of that down, and this SVG icon is going to be kind of hard to copy over, so just feel free to leave it out or just maybe find one of your own. And the next piece we're going to want is we're going to need a drop down right here that allows us to select a couple of columns to sort our options by. So to do that, we're going to use our select box component. We'll do import select box from select box there, and we will render it under this div. We're going to give this a class name of width full. We want it to take up the full width of its allotted space. Rounded XL, PX3, PY2, just to give it some good padding. And we'll make the text gray 400. The next thing we'll need is a container class name for the div that wraps around the actual select box element. We'll make this 40. And because the inner element has a width of full, that'll end up being the 40 width as well. And we'll call this sort. That'll be the name of the form data element when we post this to our backend endpoint. The last piece of required data here is the options. And to actually set up these options, let's add another variable to our constants over here. And what that's going to hold is just the key value pairs of the sorting columns that we have available. So I'll paste this over here. we're going to be able to sort by the Kudos date, by the sender's name, and by the emoji. So we're just mapping some human readable column names here to their actual underlying column name. And we can import that at the top of our search bar component. So we'll import from utils constants, and we called that sort options. Let's pass that in there, sort options. And if we go back to the page, we should now see this guy here with our options available. And the next piece that we're going to want is a button to actually submit the form. So I'll paste that over here. And this will be a button similar to the other buttons we've used in this site, where it has the round text and the nice hover animation. And it looks something like this. So now we've got our form and we need a way to submit it. So if we go back to our home page, we can update our loader function to take into account any data passed via the URL that might have our sorting and filtering options. And then we'll build up our filter objects that get passed into our filtered Kudos right here and pass them in. The way we're going to do that is if you go back to the search bar component real quick, in the form you can see we're not posting this data. This will default to a GET request. So this is going to pass our data along through the URL. And if we actually click on the submit button right now, we should see that happen. So I'll type this, maybe I'll do sender name, and I'll hit search. And we're going to see up here, we get this filter object with our search criteria and our sort key with date. So we're going to tap into that and use that to build up a couple of filtering options. And the way we're going to do that is over in Home TSX, head to your loader, and right here you're going to pull out some details from the URL. So we'll do const URL equals new URL request.url. So this is going to give us access to our different URL parameters. And the next one we're going to grab is the sort filter from the URL. So we'll do url.searchparams.get sort. And another similar one, except this will be filter. And then this next piece I will paste in little bit by bit, but we're essentially going to look for those sort and filter options. And if they're not null, we're going to build a sort or filter object that makes sense. So for example, right here, let me import the Prisma namespace again. Right here, we're going to have a sort options variable, and it will be a Kudo order by with relation input. So this is going to build up an order by option for our query. And we're saying if there was a sort option passed via the URL, let's look at some different possible values it could be. And if it's date, we're going to set this object here as our order by. Otherwise, if it's sender, we're going to want to order by the author's first name. So we're building up this object here. And if it's an emoji, as you can probably imagine, we're building up another order by object there. And that way we can order by different objects depending on what's in the URL. And that's going to be really similar to how we build up our where clause. So I'll go ahead and paste this in here. And this is going to be a similar type of object. This will be a Kudo where input. So it'll just take in the same type that a where clause would expect when dealing with a Kudo. And if a filter was passed via the URL, we're going to build up a filter. So this filter is going to allow us to search by our Kudos message or an author's first or last name. So we're using an OR clause here to do that. We're saying we want to return any Kudos where the message contains the value that we typed in, or where the author's first or last name contains the text that we typed in. And with that, we can now pass that to our getFilteredKudos function here. And this is going to expect the sort first and then the where filter. So we'll do sort options and text filter. So I'll put sort options in there and text filter over here. And then once we save that, we can go back over to the browser. I'll get rid of this search we already had in place. And we should see all of our records. And then if I were to sort by the emoji, we'll see it recognizes our filter. So that's all looking great. Our filter is working. But before we can wrap this up, we have one last thing we need to do. We need to add a way to clear our filter. So let's hop back into the code and pop open the search bar component. And what we're going to need to do is access those URL params here and have a way to clear them. So I'm going to, first of all, set up a hook that Remix provides for us called use search params. And I'll add that here. Let search params equal use search params. And I've imported that at the top. And what that does is gives us access to modifying the parameters in the URL. And then we're going to need one more thing as well. It will be the navigate function. So we'll add const navigate equals use navigate. And that's also from Remix. And the reason we need those is because we're going to add a new function called clear filters. So we'll do const clear filters equals, and what this will do is clear out the URL parameters and then navigate us to the home page. So we'll do search params dot delete filter, and we'll do a similar thing for the sort parameter. And once those are cleared, we can navigate home. And it's important to clear these out before just navigating home, because if we use this navigate function and send the user to the home page, it'll actually retain the filters that it has up here in the new page. So we want to be sure that we're navigating away and clearing out those filters. And with that, now we can add our button, and I'm going to paste that guy in. This button's going to be conditionally rendered. It should only ever show if we actually do have a filter in the URL. So I've gone ahead and added that here. And when you click on this, it will run our clear filters function. And this button is just going to be similar to the actual submit button, except it's going to have a red background instead. So let's go ahead and see what that'll look like. If we add a filter here, we hit search, we'll get this button, and if we click it, it will clear out our search criteria. We had a ton of things to do in this video, so good job following along with me through the whole thing. I hope it was useful to be able to walk through each and every little piece of the main functionality of our Kudos page. We built a bunch of different components, a bunch of different services, and got to dive deep into a bunch of different query options that Prisma provides us. And in the next video, we'll be finishing off the development of this application by allowing a user to pop open another modal and edit their user settings. So they'll be able to update their first name, their last name, and upload a profile picture. So stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching.